Okay, sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing all right. And okay, I have a very ambitious schedule today. I'm gonna try to cover a lot of things. 100% chance I won't get through all of it, which is okay. I've put slides on Moodle again, like last time, if you want them. The slides are kind of like a combination of different chapters um, of of different things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with something. We're going to do a couple of things today. I'm going to talk specifically about emotional development um, at the beginning. Then I'm going to shift gears to a couple of things in adolescence, and towards the probably middle, like probably around 10:30 or 10:20, something like that. I'm going to do a case study with everybody. And I started doing these case studies about, I don't know, 2 years ago. Um, and they're real cases. These are clients I've worked with in most cases for like a long time ago. I haven't, there's no names or anything. I've changed everything. It's super general. But I'm going to put everybody in breakout rooms. I'm going to give every group a case for you to kind of work through. And then I'm offering if you work through that case, I'm offering for that to be extra credit for the class if you'd like. You can do that. Um, I'll talk more about that when we get to it. Um, and the cases that we're working on are all clients in the adolescent, like mostly high school area. We're going to do the same thing in adulthood in the next class as well. But what I'm going to do first is talk about emotions. And I started doing this quite a while ago. I used to incorporate parts of this into all the classes. So I just decided to do one big kind of topic on emotional development. And mainly, the couple of reasons why. The first reason is clinically speaking, you know, almost all of our clinical focus will be on emotions and so, at some level with people. And so I think it's just good to talk about it. Um, and the second reason is um, it's good for it's good for us as clinicians to have an understanding of our own uh, emotions too. I know that sounds kind of strange, but like the self of a therapist is very important to have in mind when you're working with people because we oftentimes will be triggered by something we're hearing, let's say, or a story that's told, or so it's good for us to kind of be aware of our own emotional state as we're working with people. And so, and awareness is like the first step. There's a couple other steps that are important, but awareness is that first step that is super important. I'm going to go through this emotional development piece. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat or you can jump in. Please don't worry about that. Um, that's perfectly fine. Some of this won't be new to you. Some of this might be a little bit new, and I'm trying to break down quite a this is a large topic, emotional development. I'm trying to put it in pieces and then kind of make it um, applicable to us. And so, the first thing to think about when we talk about emotions is um, the idea of secondary emotions and primary emotions. And um, the reason why it's important to kind of break these down, you can kind of think about secondary emotions are most easily described by people. Like if you feel guilt or regret or, even happy or joyful, those are most easily to describe. I feel optimistic about something or I'm hopeful, those are usually fairly easy to describe and they're easier to see most of the time too, outwardly. Primary emotions are a little bit different because primary emotions are sometimes harder to put your finger on. You could say, I feel angry. Oh, what's underneath the anger? Well, maybe I'm scared about something or I'm hurt. And like hurt and fear and uh, like being left alone. Those are very specific, primary emotions that sometimes are harder to describe. The ironic part of that is, in order to help people move past certain stuck parts, they have to acknowledge and be aware of their primary emotions first and work on soothing them so that you can move forward. I'll give you an example of, then this is an example from a client I worked with um, last year. Came to me to work on anger, and actually came for himself. A lot of times when I get people that want to work on anger, it's because someone's told them they need to go to therapy most of the time because they're angry. And so that makes it hard sometimes to work with people. But this person came like, knew there was an anger issue, was really tired of it, didn't know what to do. So we did a bunch of different things, and we talked about specific, instances of being angry. And one of the things that was interesting is that I'm gonna share something here as I talk about this because I think it'll help. I'm going to use anger as just as an aside here. Um, One of the things about anger that I think is interesting when you work with people, and this is true of most emotions that we work with. We're not we're not working with anger because we're trying to stop some emotion from happening. Because that's not, first of all, that's not how emotions work. When we talk about working with anger, and this is true for any human being, we're talking about our reactions to the feeling of anger, the emotion of anger. We're talking about how do we react and respond when we feel angry. And and so as I was working with this guy, and he kind of really responded well as we kept working. And as we talked, I mean, we talked about his childhood and different scenarios as he grew up and things like that. And he grew up in a fairly chaotic, loud household. At the same time, um, one of the things that was really difficult for him was if he felt like he was losing something or losing someone, and in this particular case, his use of anger was trying to control that person leaving, or if he felt like he couldn't fix something in the right way, he would get angry and irritated. But really, it was just a fear that, he was going to lose something. And so deep underneath everything was basically, he was scared when something was happening. And once we got to that and kind of figured that out, we were able to then go, well, what are we scared about? I mean, do we, if we feel scared about something and your general response is to try to grab onto it tighter, if it doesn't work, to get louder, and that's not working for you, let's figure out other ways to do it. And so um, I will, like, I think I've said this before, I'm a huge, you know, visual person. And so I will oftentimes, like when I talk about anger, I'll talk about a roundabout. As you're approaching a roundabout, like think about if your anger is rising as you're approaching a roundabout, if you get into the roundabout and go all the way around and just keep going around and around without getting off, your anger is just getting more and more frustrating, more and more heavy. But if you get in that roundabout and okay, wait a minute, I'm getting angry, I'm feeling these emotions, I can take that first turn off and I can start, basically de-escalating my anger. And the way that you do that is to try your best to um, soothe the anger, those all these kind of words that are underneath the surface of the iceberg here. Those are the things you try to grab onto and try to help people, be aware of and talk about, and then help them see that they can de-escalate, how they're feeling. There's a word on here at the bottom. It's very small, insecure, like feeling insecure, and this word at the bottom of feeling hurt is one of them, and a fear is a big one. Those are those particular emotions really power a lot of different reactions and responses. And so if you can kind of figure out what those are, that really, really helps quite a bit. And so for this guy, it was kind of, we trial and error to try to find ways to help him kind of work through it, but he was able to really make a lot of changes. And mainly he was really able to do it himself. Once he figured out what he was feeling, he was able to then go, wait a minute, I'm just scared. I don't have to, he was pretty, he wasn't violent like towards people, but he would just yell and he would, he just, there were things that would happen and just things wouldn't go well for him. And he was on the brink of losing his family. He had lost a job before. So it was a big change for him to try to figure that out. And mainly it's because people just don't really understand necessarily or grow up understanding, what emotions are, how they work, and what you can do to kind of work through them. I think we do. I think we do a little bit better job now in our world to at least identify emotions. If you talk to anyone and that's 25 and younger, 30 and younger, more than likely they grew up even in school like identifying emotions in some way. And that's not bad. I think that's a great thing. The there's some things that we need to do it on top of that, but I think it's good to identify. If you talk to people in maybe later generations, it's not like people didn't feel emotions. You just didn't talk about it as much, or you weren't necessarily bringing them up as much. And I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus. This is just how things are. And so most of the time when you're working with people and they're having trouble identifying or you know, being aware of their emotions. You can use things like emotion wheels. Um, there's different charts you can use now. You can Google tons of different visual descriptions. I've given emotion wheels like because I work with people virtually, so a lot of times I'll pull up like an emotion wheel on the screen and show it to clients and let them tell me how they're feeling. Um, if they're not really good at doing that at the beginning, you might not get an emotion wheel with like seven. There's some that have like 70 emotions on them. You probably want one, maybe with 10 or 15 to let them kind of get used to doing that. You can do that. That works well when people are like flooded or feeling overwhelmed. If you see people, like if you're working with a couple and let's say one of them is stonewalling, like just shut down, it's mainly probably because they're flooded emotionally or they have so many thoughts and emotions going on at the same time. They're unable to say them. Sometimes giving someone something to look at, they can at least start saying, I think this is what's happening. It lets them start getting what's on the inside outside, which is another thing that's very important when we start talking about emotion, when we start expressing it, we really want to get what's on the inside outside. Now, the interesting thing is when we're in early childhood, it's very difficult for kids to do that. That's why play therapy is so effective and different types of objects or letting them color or draw. That's because that gets inside things outside. That helps adults too. You can have adults write things out, or um, I've even done uh, sand tray therapy with adults. I've done that before, and that actually helps really well. Um, we talked about this a little bit last class. you know, expressing emotions in terms of kids, and this is true for early childhood, especially like that early, 4, 5, all the way up to 7, 8, 9. Mostly the kids' ability to express emotion is mostly at that point influenced by a parent's response to that expression, which is mainly a behavior, right? If they behave in a certain way and adults respond to that in a certain way, kids might get the clue of like, hey, maybe I don't want to respond that way anymore. And they might start not really expressing how they're feeling necessarily. Um, and so uh, it's I've I've spent many, many sessions with parents talking about kids and adult adolescents too, talking about, hey, maybe they just don't have the words yet. They might not know how to say, what we're saying. Some of that's changing, I would say, but it's just something to understand. As kids get older and get into the adolescent years, the ability to regulate emotions becomes more and more available to them, and they're able to do it a little bit more, which is good. By the time we become adults, We need to be able to really regulate our own emotions. And that's kind of how it works developmental wise. Um,
Hey, Professor,
yeah.
I have a question. Sometimes I feel like I love that we're talking about emotions and kids in particular are better at it. But sometimes I feel like I teach adolescents or early childhood or late childhood, sorry, and they sometimes are like, I've got all these emotions and like wearing it as like this weird badge of honor that they don't understand. And that it's like they understand the lingo, but not anything else that goes with it. Do you see that happening at all?
So yeah, I'm going to talk about this actually. That's a good question. Um, I think one of the things that's happening with that, because I think you're right. Um, that's why I said earlier, the first step to a regulation is awareness, like being aware of your emotions. The second step is being able to identify them correctly, which is kind of specific. In other words, there's a difference between saying, I feel like you're not listening to me, and I feel like you're doing, you're just being, you're angry at me and you're not listening. There's a difference between saying that and saying, I feel frustrated because I don't feel heard. Those are two different things. And what we've done in our world, in some ways, is we've said that thoughts and emotions are the same because we're describing them the same and they're not. Okay. When we feel an emotion, we also have a thought that comes with it. But they're not the same thing. We have to pull them apart. I feel frustrated is that's an emotional expression. I think I'm tired right now and I think maybe I need to take a nap. Those are thoughts, right? Those aren't emotions. Does that make sense? What one of the things that we've done well, especially with kids, and this is in school for the most part, what we've done well is help them to know that there's emotions and that they're okay to feel and that they're okay to have. That's awesome. What we haven't done a great job of, I think, is the next part, which is Amy, what you're asking. The next part of that is, what do I do with it? Now what? Well, okay, that's cool. You feel XYZ. Does that mean you can behave any way you want, or does that mean all of a sudden that's actually what's happening? Now, what I'm about to talk about, and this is part of the next thing we were gonna discuss today. There's a big difference between feeling something that might be true and it actually being true. Okay, now y'all listen to me. Don't hear, please don't. I know I'm being recorded. I've talked about this a lot. Dr. Bedard's not saying that feeling something it shouldn't be validated. I'm not saying that. Okay. What I'm saying is sometimes we feel something really strongly. We have an emotion that's tied to it that's very strong. It might not be true. That's what's so hard about it when you work with people. Okay. Kids, adolescents, adults, doesn't matter. If someone feels something really strongly, a strong emotion, I'm talking about like hurt, like sad, you know, um, anxiety is worry is a massive one. If you feel something, you think that that is just true, like whatever's associated with it is true. And that might not be the case. I feel like everyone's laughing at me. Okay. So you're worried about how you look. Yes, that makes sense. Is everyone laughing? Probably not true. Feels true, right? Probably not true. Does that make sense? This is a big deal because if we don't teach these things, then what happens is people grow up and we have trouble having conversations because then we're like, wait a minute, you know, like feeling out of control is another example. Anxiety is one that makes us feel like we don't have control. I was talking about the client I had earlier, the last year. I feel anxious and I feel worried. I feel scared. I don't have control. I know it feels that way, but is that actually true? We have
Can I
control
throw
of
some?
something, some things. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
My
you're
name's
okay.
Michelle. I just have a thought and see if you agree with me, or maybe we can like figure this out. I feel like, at least in my experience, the emotion is true. I mean, if they're feeling scared, then they're scared. Like that's real.
Mhm.
It's real. But the thing that is causing the emotion might not be real. Would you say
Yeah,
that's accurate?
it can be. Yeah. So we always validate emotion. We don't have to validate behavior,
Sorry,
right?
sorry.
So
Yeah.
no, you're fine. You're fine. We we validate emotion. I'm scared. Okay. That must be really tough to be scared. We don't have to validate behavior. We don't have to.
Right. Yeah. It's not saying that the behavior that follows is justifiable. And it's not even saying that the thing that caused the emotion is real. It could totally not exist, but the emotion is real. And I feel like when I've done therapy, that's been a good starting point for me. Because if someone comes at me and says, well, your emotion, I mean, obviously as therapists, we wouldn't say your emotion's not real. But if someone can express to me, I know what you're feeling is real. You're feeling super worried. There's no question that is a real feeling for you.
Yeah.
Let's figure out what came before and what comes after and where the truth lies. But that's kind of for them that's real. And I think it for me anyway, it would be easy for me to slide into invalidating that feeling to say it's not real. But I totally agree that the behavior that follows or the thing that even caused it is just, it feels like a good common ground to start on. Yeah, that
Yeah,
thing is real,
yeah,
and
yeah,
but let's figure out the before and after.
yeah. So here's one way to think about it. And this is not my phrase. Uh, I got this from Susan David from her book Emotional Agility, which I've repeated over and over, and I really love it. Our emotions are not directives; they're just data. Our emotions give us information about something that's going on, either around us or to us, for sure. But they don't have to tell us what to do. They don't have to be in charge of like our behavior. The problem is that the bigger the emotion feels, the more it feels like it's in charge. And we're not robots. Sometimes we're gonna make even decisions off emotion. I mean, we're gonna do that. We're not robots, right? We're not like just machines that figure things out. We're people. We make decisions off emotion sometimes. But the other thing to remember is whatever we're feeling, no matter how big or small the emotion is, if you wait long enough, it will dissipate after time. So anger is a good example. For example, when you work with a couple or a family and there's an argument and people are escalated to a certain level, it takes the human body physiologically around 20 minutes to kind of calm down if you're doing things to help you calm down. Emotions aren't really different. We could test this now. If any of you right now wrote down an emotion or two that you feel right now, at the end of class, if I asked you, there's a good chance it's different. That probably is true because our emotions they feel big. I think going back to something Amy asked and a little bit about what Michelle's saying, I think it's great that we're aware of emotions, but let's don't make them this like blow it out of proportion too much because our emotions are important, but so are our thoughts and our behaviors. We need a balance of all three, right? So how we think, what we feel, and what we do, they need to work together.
I got a quick
And that's
question.
and that's very important. Yeah.
I was wondering just your thoughts on, to me, it just seems like from my generation to my kids' generation, they're more open with expressing emotions and more okay with having emotions. Do you think that with each generation, it kind of gets more okay to have emotions and express them?
So that's a great question. I think there's a couple of things. The first thing is every generation has emotions. We've had emotions since we were created. So emotions are not the issue. Expressing them now, that might be different, like different people. Now, this is not just generational, culturally. Like if we could talk about this culturally, we could talk about it based on gender. We could talk about it based on like whatever experiences people have had are going to express maybe emotions differently than other people. Um, Maybe in our world right now, it's maybe more acceptable to express emotion, let's say, than maybe 30 years ago or 50
Mm-hmm.
years ago. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's true. That's probably true. But that doesn't mean we've all of a sudden have emotions now. We've always had them,
Right.
right? We just haven't always expressed them in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that uh, another thing to remember about them is that if we do want to, let's say, suppress something emotionally, the way emotions work is we don't get to pick and choose what we suppress. We can't just suppress ones that don't feel good. If we try to do that, then we end up suppressing all of them. You either suppress all of them or none of them. That's how it works. So you can 100% shut your emotions down if you want to. You can do that. 100%. I wouldn't suggest doing that, but you can do that. But when you do that, you actually suppress all of them because that's how emotions work. Of the three areas of our brain that I just mentioned, emotion, thoughts or cognitions or behavior, emotion is the one we have least control over happening to us because emotions happen automatically without a lot of control from us. We don't choose necessarily how we feel or what we are feeling. Now, we can choose what we think and we can choose our behavior for sure. And this kind of circling back now to what Amy was bringing up earlier. We don't, it's a myth to say once we express our emotion, then our behaviors will be fine. That's actually not true, I don't think. Once we express our emotion, awesome. Now, and this is what you can do with clients, and I do this with everybody I ever work with, even teenagers. When you feel XYZ, whatever that emotion is, what do you usually do? Well, do this or this or this, whatever. Does that work for you? No. Well, then let's figure out another behavior, right? So when I feel X, when I feel this emotion, I'm going to try doing this, whatever that behavior is, right? Or I'm going to try thinking these things. I brought up that kind of cheeseball example of everyone's looking at me. Well, that's an adolescent thought. There's a couple of things adolescents are thinking almost all the time, 24 hours a day. Everyone's looking at me, and do they like what they see? Those are massive thoughts in their head. Massive. And they're not abnormal. That's because of the stage of development that they're in. So that's why a lot of their emotions are so heavily tied to social either peers or family or what people see or don't see, which is also why social media is so important in their lives too. Which we're going to talk about that separately. So let me talk about one more thing that is really important, and this is an area of emotions that I think is really important when you work with people, especially if we talk about traumatic experiences. The emotions that we have don't have a memory of their own. They just live in a certain context or a certain setting. So let me give you an example. And this is from another client. This person I feel like they were like 4 or 5. They're learning to ride a bike and had training wheels, and they took the training wheels off. And most of the time, when you take training wheels off, you fall. I mean, you don't usually ride the bike immediately right after because you get scared or whatever. And this person's parent was out helping, and they kept falling, and finally the parent just kind of stormed off and kind of mumbled like, "You're never going to get this," something like that. And so the kid, now I'm talking, this is an adult I'm talking to telling me the story. And we talked about like, what did, how'd that feel? Well, it hurt my feelings. You know, I felt dejected, and I felt like not good enough. I felt so sad, like a really deep sadness. And they started crying right then. Now, this is 40 years before, right, that this happened. But that emotion all of a sudden came out. The emotion they had at 5 came out at 45. Okay. The emotion doesn't have a memory, it just lives in a context, right? So they felt that same emotion that they had when they were 5. And one of the things we did, we talked about it openly. What are you feeling? Well, I feel sad. Well, what's the difference between 5-year-old you and 45-year-old you? Well, I can ride a bike now, which is kind of funny. It was kind of a jokey thing, but that's what people do when they get too deep in emotion. They'll try to pull out a little bit. And I had to gently say, well, that makes sense, but tell me about like, do you feel sad now? Well, I feel sad, but it's different because now I know I didn't do anything wrong. Like I just couldn't ride my bike. But as a 5-year-old, I thought something was wrong with me. Now all of a sudden that emotion has a different context. Does that make sense? Like this is we're having a different discussion. Still sad, right? Still feel sad, but you have a different context. So emotions live in these different contexts. They don't necessarily have a memory, but they might come out in different times. Now, what I said about this one, this could have been, I felt sad at 45 and something happened when I was 42 and you felt sad, right? It doesn't have to be a childhood memory. It could be something that happened last week. It's when and now we could say this about happy good feelings too, like feeling happy about certain things when you were a kid or a teenager, and it's having the same feeling um, as an adult. Uh, you could have the same, very similar feeling, like happiness or joyfulness. So emotions have a context that they live in. They don't necessarily have a memory. And that what's good about that with clients is that if you can help them see that they no, they don't live back there, they're here. Their emotions just back there. Let's bring the emotion forward and talk a little bit about, okay, wait a minute, what's different now? Well, I didn't do anything wrong, you know. I just couldn't ride my bike. He said it just like that, just like I just couldn't ride my bike. And all of a sudden you're like, well, yeah, what kid can ride their bike after they take their training wheels off? I mean, not very many. I mean, then you have these conversations about, wait a minute, I'm not, I think maybe I just didn't like my dad talking to me that way. Could you say anything when you're 5? Probably not. Can you now at 45? Yeah, sure. If someone did, right, if someone said something or did something now that you're like, hey, hang on a second, you can speak up for yourself. You can say things now. When you're 5, it's a lot harder, right? But now you have a little bit more choice. So those are that's like I said, I know I've spent, you know, 35 minutes talking about something it's a massive topic. Books and books and article have been written about this. Um, but this is a part of working with people that I find to be very important to know about because emotions are so powerful in people's lives. And if people don't know how to like put them in the right context, it can really be difficult for people to work through. And like I said, we're all gonna work off emotion at some level. All of us do. We're not robots. It's hard to do, but being aware, being able to name it, and then being able to say, well, wait a minute, let me think through this and not just feel through it. That is a skill. If you can help people learn, it really helps a lot. And it's okay for people. And I think Michelle was talking about this a little bit. It's okay to even say, look, hey, emotions happen. This is how you feel. That's okay. You're not doing anything wrong by feeling something. You're not doing anything wrong by having an emotion. That's okay. Let's talk about it. Let's don't be scared of it. Don't be scared of it. It's okay to talk about, because it doesn't have to be in charge. So anyway, all of that to say, um, that's just kind of the super basic, very, very basic understanding of emotions. So does anybody have questions about that? Okay. So I'm gonna talk about adolescence, and I wanna jump into now Bria asked a question about this is a so Bria asked a question: how would you recommend validating the emotion in a situation such as betrayal? For example, if you're dealing with a couple that has experienced infidelity. Okay, first of all, we don't have enough time to talk about that because that's extremely complex. Um, and what I would say overarchingly is that anytime you have any trust breaking at all, you have to take your time to work through the trust breaking and then take your time to rebuild the trust. And it takes a lot of time to do that. And it takes intentional effort and intentional work on both people's part. So that's a great question. I wish I had time to answer it, but I don't. Um, so I'm going to take the coward's way out and skip it. It's really complex, but it's a great question. But you can always validate how someone's feeling, 100%. You know, I mean, there's plenty of people. There's plenty of people in marriages that have difficult times that don't commit any kind of trust breaking activity either. And we could talk about that. I mean, there's a lot of areas you could go into, but that's a pretty tough one. But that's a good question. That's a good question. Okay, let me talk about a couple of things real quick and set up a couple of things. When we talked about childhood before, we talked about this idea of self. Um, you have an idea of like me and other people around you. As we get into adolescence and from 14, 15 all the way through the mid 20s, we're talking about identity, like our self identity, who we are, what we are. um, in some ways it's been tied to what we do, like career wise. That's also been a part of the discussion, which for some teenagers is fine to talk about, and some aren't ready to talk about. So we'll talk about some of those things too. But this identity formation is very important because there's a couple things that are happening um, during the whole time of adolescence, and that is figuring out who they are apart from their family, and in some level apart from their friends, even though at the beginning, like in high school, junior high and high school, that doesn't happen as much. They're still part of your friend group, but as you get older, you start to get individualized. It's called a process of individuation. Individuation, and when you do that, then you become another person, for yourself. The second thing that's happening, and this is happening mainly as we get into like junior, senior year of high school and beyond. It's like, okay, I've got all these things I've been taught, and maybe even some beliefs, and maybe some values. Do I believe that? Is that is that who I am? And that's what I want to be about. And they might push against some belief systems or values, and that's normal. It's not seen as normal, and it's really frustrating to the adults in their world. But the adults in the world, and this is what I talk about when I meet with parents, just remember that we all push against something at some point, and we have to in order for us to know what we believe. This is what's crazy about, or it's called crazy making behavior with teenagers, is it seems as though overnight they change. When that's kind of sort of true because their brains are turned on in a different way, and they're starting to get rid of things and pick up things that are different for them. And they're trying to work through them and talk about them. And it takes a pretty steady adult figure in their life to walk through that with them because it feels so wishy washy. Because it kind of is, because they're trying to figure a lot of things out. Now, this was easy. This was hard enough without social media also in their ear. This was hard no matter what, right? This was not like, we used to just talk about peer pressure and which is still around, but it's different now. Like if we talk about things like bullying, let's say, or if we talk about things like harassment or anything like that, we can't just talk about it just physically happening in front of them. We have to talk about what happens, virtually as well. Like there's things that follow us now, right? If something happened at school, 30 years ago and it didn't go well, they could go home and they were away from it. Now it's with them all the time, or it's with these, people all the time. Um, I've had more than one client, quite a few, that have even had their kids were basically assault, kind of assaulted virtually. Someone created fake accounts and thought it would, acted like they were them. I mean, I've seen all kinds of crazy stuff, but that makes going through this process even more difficult. So it's hard enough anyway to go be a teenager and kind of figure out who you are and what you believe and what you don't and what you are going to hold on to and what you're not. And that's going to last for a good 10 or 12 years. I mean, it's a long process. Now some for the majority, when I say majority, I mean overwhelming majority of teenagers, they don't like act out because of this. They're not like they don't go necessarily crazy or anything as they go through this process. But the ones that do get the most airplay, and so therefore everyone's painted with the same brush. So this goes back to something I was talking about earlier. We could feel like every teenager, quote unquote, is XYZ way. And that's not true. That's just not true. Some of them act out in a certain way, yes. But the overwhelming majority of them don't do that. They're just trying to figure stuff out. That's the truth, statistically speaking. But we only hear about the ones that are, acting out the most, let's say. Um, so there's a great video of a TED Talk that I posted on Moodle. If you haven't watched it, you really should watch it. She does a great job of explaining this. She talks about demonizing adolescence, which I personally agree. I've thought that for a long, long time. I've worked with teenagers and adolescents for over 30 years. I've worked with multiple generations now. The first generation I worked with would have been, let's see, kids born in, so it would have been a millennial. The first generation I would have worked with would have been like early millennial kids, and then everything in every generation past that. There's not a lot of difference in how they develop. There's a ton of difference in how they've grown up, in the culture in which they live. Ton of difference in how they respond. For sure, has been different. Um, and so this idea um, that teenagers are just bad or they're just something's wrong or that, listen, we've all gone through things. Most of you probably just grew up at a time where just people, you didn't have social media, so no one knew what you were doing. If we had social media back when I was growing up, I mean, I did stupid stuff, said dumb things. We nothing was tracked or recorded. It's not true now, right? We've done and said dumb stuff for centuries. We've just not been able to record it and see it. That's all.
I also think the other thing that makes it hard is that your parents can track your location everywhere you go now. And when we were growing up, it was easier to not be at the right place at the right time because there was no location tracking.
Well, all right. So what I'm about to say, no one's gonna like, but I don't care. I don't track my kids. I don't need more anxiety. I don't need to know every single thing that's going on. I can track them. I have definitely told parents to get off Life 360 because it's driving them crazy because they're watching every single thing. I know that's controversial to some people. I get it. I understand. Um, it doesn't change what you're doing or not doing with your kids when they're away from you. They're going to be doing whatever they want. I've seen kids put their phones in other people's car and let that car go to someone's house so the parents think they're there. The kids have multiple Instagram accounts or multiple Snapchat accounts. I mean, this is not a world where all of a sudden we can track everything and just everything's okay. It just causes more anxiety to a certain extent. Now, having said that, I totally understand why parents track their kids too. I get it. I've got two teenagers. I worry about them. They both drive now. They're both out later. I get it. I get that part. I get that part. I'm just saying, if we really wanted to be extreme, to Amy's point, I mean, I never had adults in my life ever. We didn't have to worry about adults being around. We just didn't have them. In the 70s and 80s, there were no adults like wanting to hang out with us. That just wasn't the case. It's not like that now. It's the opposite. Now it's the opposite. We have more adults in kids' lives, which is not necessarily a bad thing either. Because one of the things that we know, now this is something that's statistically and researched pretty heavily now. One of the things that we know about the adolescent world, and I think there's a couple of reasons why this is true. One of the things that we know now is that adolescents need more adult involvement now, not less. Now, when I say involvement, I don't mean lording over and being overbearing. I'm not talking about it that way. I'm saying presence, more adult presence. And here, there's a couple of things that are happening that I think make this true. The first thing is what we're talking about now. It's a lot more difficult. This is a lot more difficult time period to grow up. It's a lot more complex. In the past, when we've had complex situations and kids were to rely on their peers for like help and being, advice and things like that, that's still happening. But the advice is different now because it's such a complex world. So having adult presence, specifically having non non-guardian, non-parental adult presence is becoming more and more important. And I'm talking about presence, just somewhere for them to go, a person for them to be around and talk to, a safe, secure adult for them to be around, which unfortunately, takes years to develop that type of relationship, and you have to do it intentionally. That's actually true. One of the things that we need more of in our world with adolescents, and this is true, and I think this is actually true now, not just junior high and high school. I think it's true in college now. It used to be a little different, but I'm seeing this now more. Having good, secure, safe adults in their life can really help them as they make these transitions. They're still going to make their own transition. They're still going to figure things out for themselves. But it really helps them tremendously. The second reason why this is important, and we haven't talked about this yet, one of the biggest changes in a person's life is puberty. That's a massive change. It's a sexual awakening. It's a physical awakening. There's a lot of emotions involved. There's hormonal and bodily changes that are happening. And that process in and of itself is very complex. So if you throw in everything else on top of that, puberty is happening no matter what. So now we've got multiple things going on at once. And now if we interject this idea of adult presence, what we're actually doing is helping kids, hopefully, helping kids see that they're okay. It's okay. This sucks right now. My wife and I took the stance in junior high, for example, when our kids were in junior high. Let's just survive. We just want to get through junior high. Let's just survive it. It's awkward. It's very difficult. Some kids it's not. Some kids don't have a hard time. We know statistically speaking, girls, like specifically for girls that mature earlier have an easier time in junior high and early high school, and then have a little bit harder time after, because other girls catch up to them and they get less attention. We know that. That I think the author talks about that in the book. For boys that mature later, have a much harder time almost all the way through high school. But when they do finally mature, maybe it's later, let's say let's say 16, 17, 18 versus 13, 14, 15, those boys have a harder time early, but actually do okay after. And some of that's self-esteem, some of that's just kind of self-concept. Okay. But we also know that everybody matures at different times. Not everybody matures at the same time. Like a girl's cycle, it's not uncommon for a 9 or 10 year old to start their cycle at 9 or 10, but it's super uncommon for a boy to start puberty at 9 or 10. Girls' puberty is starting earlier, boys is starting a little bit later. And that's been happening for a while. Now, there's some evolutionary reasons why people have kind of tried to talk about that. That girls' puberty is often has started earlier than boys for a long time anyway, but we're talking about a little bit bigger of a gap. It's a little larger gap um, when it comes to that. All of that whole process, though, is a long process, not a short process. Um, and so uh, that if we throw that into the mix of everything else, with the fact that their brains are the most sponge-like now, um, almost the exact same amount of sponge-like when they were infants and toddlers. There's a lot of things going on at one time inside their head. And so sometimes, and that's to me, this is another reason why just having good, solid, safe adults just in their life that can be non-judgmental of what they say or do, that's very hard to do, and can be supportive of them. That's very hard to do. This is one of the things I think about and I talk with my clients when we talk about adolescence. You can't really tell this to a teenager because they don't. My kids have heard me say it and they hate it. I don't, that's fine. But I tell other adults this. This adolescent period, kind of like childhood, this isn't who they're, this is just who they are now. This is not who they're going to be, right? A 15-year-old is going to look and sound very different at 25 and then 30. Very different. But one of the valid concerns that parents always have, and this is true for all the clients you work with, one of the valid concerns is they are impressionable at this age too. There's a high level of impression that they go through, especially around high school and into the early 20s. That's true. It's very true, which is another reason why you need good, safe, caring adults in their life to just kind of be a ballast, I guess. It's okay for it's okay for us to be curious and supportive of people when they have ideas that are like, oh, okay, that's weird, or that's very different than what you thought 5 years ago. That's okay. Most of the time, they come out of that having kind of thought through it and worked through it on their own. Now, again, I'm giving you this is a 20,000 foot view. Okay, this is super high view just in general. What I like about the book, what I think the book does a good job of, is it gets into the weeds of like actual cognition. I would encourage everyone to really read about like neurologically what's happening. They're weeding out different thoughts and they're taking on new thoughts. That's very important to remember. I think the book, this edition, I don't think so much the edition before it. This edition actually does incorporate a little bit of screen time talk and social media talk, which I think is good. That's going to be happen now from now on because we have more studies now. We just have more information about it, which is good too. That'll be super helpful. So the book does a good job of that. There's some things that that have always been the same, like for centuries. Like our brain development's been basically the same. How we emotionally develop has been about the same. How puberty happens has basically been about the same. But the environment in which we live in has changed drastically. And so I think that's just important too. Um, all right, let me take a step back because I've talked about a ton of stuff. I know I'm talking a lot today. Yeah, any questions about anything we've talked about so far?
Would you say that adolescence is the most difficult life development stage?
I think that's I think that's a great question. What do you guys think?
And I'm like, I only ask this because you mentioned how you identify with certain things, like with your profession. In 2023, January, I lost my job of 23 years. And it felt like I was going through adolescence again, trying to figure out who I am because I really didn't realize how much that career kind of defined me as a person. I thought it defined me as a person. And so now restructuring, it's like, okay, what do I do now? Who am I? What am I supposed to do? So I kind of related to that adolescence period that you mentioned. So I was just wondering what you thought.
I don't know. What do y'all think?
I think it's so unique to each person because I think some people go through adolescence and they are fairly okay, and their mid 20s are where life kicks them in the trash and they really struggle. So I don't know that I say there's one stage that's hardest for every person.
I teach upper elementary through middle school, and I really feel that adolescence is, I think what makes it so difficult is not only the hormones, but their brain isn't developed. So they're dealing with all these new hormones and not really even knowing what emotions are, um, on top of their brain's not developed. So they do these things that sometimes you have to think, what were you thinking? Well, they weren't thinking, because between the hormones and the brain development and and not really being in touch with emotions or even knowing what that is a lot of times, I think it is a really, really difficult. I grew up in Generation X, and I think today we do a better job because back then it was like, if you cry, I'll give you something to cry about. Just let it, no big deal. We weren't really talking about emotions. And I think nowadays we are doing a better job. But I really think adolescence is a very, very difficult time.
Anybody else?
I think that adolescence is probably the most complex and the most challenging stage, just because of, like you were mentioning, Lynette, the chemical changes that are happening in the body and the desire to want to find your own direction yourself, but not know quite the best ways to do that.
And I think too, what you're talking about with the internet now, I was watching when The Social Dilemma came out on Netflix. That was just very eye-opening because I feel I see a lot more girls cutting, uh, going to mental health places and then coming back. I now work at an international baccalaureate school, which is very high academics. We have a lot of kids who want to commit suicide, a lot more now than in the past. And so, I think social media has a lot to do with that, and expectations of parents and parents seeing where the kids are, like you were talking about, every second. They are just like the parents are enmeshed with these children, these adolescents, and not allowing them to just be who they are. And I think a lot of that comes from fear of parents. Parents have a lot of fear nowadays, especially with social media. But that's just my own opinion.
Well, you're talking about, okay, we could talk about Lynette, what you just brought up, we could talk about for a long time. There's a lot of things in it to unpack. I will say this. There is there's a need to be involved in your kids' lives without being overbearing for 100%. Like we need to let them make mistakes. That's 100% true. The issue that we're having now too, and this is a product of our world, is that some mistakes that used to be able to kind of work through easier are not as easy to work through now. One slip in a certain area for a teenage boy, it could be seen as assault, let's say, by a girl. or a girl saying something to a kid online could be seen as cyberbullying or something like that. Like, and I'm not saying these are things we should just gloss over, and not that. But there's so few margin for error now with kids that um, if something is seen a certain way and it's done a certain way, that's one of the reasons why I have experienced some parents being so involved is because they don't want their kids to make those kinds of mistakes, which is totally understandable because that could really ruin someone's life or it could really put a hamper on like their development and growth. So we do live in a world that's very hyper vigilant, um, for sure. So that's kind of one of the things that I think is definitely happening now that hasn't always been a part of our world. The one of the and I do want to talk about one thing before we move forward is um, uh, the idea behind like some of the newer models of like parent adolescent relationship. The book talks about this. I think in the 12th chapter, maybe the third. I can't remember the chapter, but it's like in the 12 or 13, somewhere in there. Um, they talk a little bit about like attachment and autonomy. So attachment, when we have secure attachments, we feel more autonomous. In other words, we feel safer to kind of explore and be individuals. And in that case, if that's the case, then parents start to transition from kind of like almost like a cop when they're kids to more of like a coach to and then into like a consultant kind of role, which is not bad. I think that's a pretty good. That's a probably a pretty good transition where kids are still kind of making their own decisions, but their parents are still there. Here's an example I'll give you, like a little kid example. I've had many clients. This is before COVID when I was still meeting with people in person. There were a lot of times where parents they'd have to bring their kids, like little kids, to the counseling session just because they couldn't get childcare. And if they would bring like a 2 or 3 year old, let's say, a kid that could walk and talk a little bit and like toys and things, they bring toys for them and all those things. So I started having things in my office in little areas in my office that they could, kind of play. And so if you watch a kid that comes in that they will sit with their parents and maybe sit in their lap still with a stranger like me, and eventually they might get down and they might kind of look around and then eventually they might wander off and then eventually they might see something and go play with it, but they might still look back to mom and dad or whoever the attachment figure is. They might still look back. And that's the normal process of attachment. And that's we can transition that idea or we can translate that idea really easily in the adolescent world. Adolescents are going to go away. They're going to start trying things and they're going to start experimenting in certain ways. Now we want that to be healthy things, but sometimes it's not. But they always can come back to that parental figure and kind of get that, that attachment. And so that the anxiety that you have with a 2 or 3 year old kind of exploring an office world is a lot lower than the anxiety of a teenager going out driving their car away from home on a Friday night, right? So one of the things that we have to talk about too when we talk about things clinically is okay, for parents, one of the things that they're also dealing with is an elevated worry about their kids. And that is a normal, natural thing too. And that's okay to talk about and talk about it openly. What are your concerns? What are you worried about? Do you have a fear about this? What is it? And sometimes it's not just like a control thing. It's just a worry because they care and love their kids. I mean, that's a normal thing to talk about. Um, and so that also brings out, because of that, that also sometimes brings out certain types of conflict between parents and adolescents. And that's a normal uh, part of development too. It's normal to have conflicts in our families. As a matter of fact, if you don't have conflicts, you don't learn how to have a conflict. And so it's okay to have conflicts. Now, I'm not saying it's fun. It's not great. You don't like it. You don't enjoy it. Um, there's a mantra that we have in our house, and that's this. We started saying this back when our kids were probably, my kids are 15 months apart, so they basically go through everything at the same time. But when my daughter was 13, my son was 14, it was like, okay, this is 10 more years. We just got to get through 10 more years. Because that's, you're going to have you're going to have these times. This is going to happen. Um, now, having said that, the people that we're going to see in our offices are not the people that are going through kind of normal developmental things. It's mostly going to be on the extreme side, right? So the conflicts you're going to see are going to be a little more difficult, probably a little more complex. So one of the things I encourage people to do is I encourage students to learn as much as you can, especially if you know you're going to work with adolescents or couples or families. Like if you know that, I would encourage you to start learning as much as you can about like that age group and working with those families and what that looks like to help them and different models of therapy that work well with that. And that stuff's pretty easy to discover. If you're not going to work with families, you still want to know that information. But if you're going to work with families or couples, you definitely want to learn about conflict, um, how to work through conflict and how to work through emotions and how to de-escalate and different interventions that help and things like that. You definitely want to learn those things because those are the people we get, right? We don't get people that are probably okay and just having normal kind of day to day. It's usually pretty bad, and they've usually waited a long time before they come in. And most of the time, it's you know a mom or a dad dragging the family in. Most of the time, if that's what you work with. So okay, I don't want to run out of time. I want to do this case study with everyone. But does anybody have any questions about that? I'm going to do a quick transition here.
While you're transitioning, I'll just throw out, I feel like one of the unique problems parents have, especially those that kind of are starting to slide into helicopter parenting. I've got 3 teens right now. And the tricky part for me is that I think it used to be so natural I mean, not natural, but teens that come home from school, everybody's home. There's only one person to tell about your day. And attachment, you still had to work at it, but staying attached, there was more natural places to do that. And now, um, I mean, I have compassion for those helicopter parents because if my kids on social media, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent of them walking through the red light district in Dallas. Like I don't know who they're talking to. I don't know what that person's like. I don't know. There's just like these weird opportunities for them to connect. And I have had to fight so hard to stay connected with them. And a lot of the time I lose the battle. They choose connection with someone else on their phone in another room. And so I think that's just a unique problem parents are having.
Yeah,
At least this
I
parent
agree.
is.
No, I agree. I agree. I
I
agree.
think what I was speaking about working at an international school is we have a lot of parents from all over the world. So these children are never given, they're told by third grade, they know what they're going to be because their parents have told them what they're going to be. So their parents, basically control every little part of their life. They don't have cell phones. They don't, and there's a lot of, especially academically, stress on them. They're expected to have the perfect score all the time. And so we see these kids that just, it's very difficult, especially being raised in America, but their parents are from a different culture. So that's, I think, a little bit of what I was speaking to more than just like American kids. So.
Yeah, we could have a whole other discussion about cultural differences for sure. And
I've
it
learned
depends
a
on
lot. I've learned
yeah,
a lot. I can tell you
yeah,
that.
yeah. I'm going to put you guys in the group. So there's going to be 4 groups. And then what I'm going to do is after you're in your groups, I'm going to jump in and give each group the case study. Like um, I can't put it in the chat because it's too long, but I'm going to put it in, I'll give it to you when you're in your group. So I'm going to go ahead and start that process. So she should be able to join a group now.
Hello.
Okay. If everybody, if just if a one person in the group could just email or Moodle message me everyone that was in your group, that'd be super helpful. Um, I think I got a screenshot of everyone, but I just want to make double sure that I got everybody. Okay. Um, Here's what I want to do with the time that we have left. I'll be better with time management next class, but um, what I would like to know is, um, and let's just start with group 3. The main thing I'd like to know is just what kind of questions did everyone want to ask? Like what things did people want to know? Because obviously I gave you super basic information. Um, what kinds of questions did you want to know? If we could start with the third group, that'd be awesome.
Okay, so guys, I'll jump in. It was me, Misha Shakithia, and Brandy, and oh my God, I'm blanking. I'm sorry. Anyways, what we got into was we had a 14-year-old client, female client who had come in with her father on the first session, was very, very quiet during her session, and we as counselors had diagnosed her as moderately depressed. And on the second session, she was way more engaged and way more talkative. And so on that note, we had to assume that the second session was by herself and without her dad. And so initially the questions we wanted to get into were just really just first conversation, second conversation things, because we feel like on the second session when we had her alone, it was really the first session at that point. And so as counselors, we agreed that we wanted to just first understand if they're happy that they're here in this counseling session. Is this good for them, or are they miserable and they want out right away? And that helps us navigate the future conversations. What do they hope to gain from this experience of being in therapy? Do they have experience with therapy before? And have they learned anything from that? And then, finally connect with them with her on we noticing that you're way more engaged in the second session without your dad. Can you help me understand what is different in this time around versus the first time? And just drill into those kind of conversations right there. And then also just get to know them more, know their world, know their life. What's their life like at school? Do they enjoy school? What's their relationship like with their parent, with her parents, her friends, her peers, extracurricular activities? Is she, any type of romantic relationship or interest in those areas? That way, we can really build that empathetic client counselor relationship so that anything said forward, we already have like a basis of understanding of who she is and understanding her world, her problems through her eyes. So those were like the initial questions out the
Good.
gate.
Yeah. Good.
And then the other questions, of course, were like about approaches from the cognitive, biological, socio-emotional perspective. And where we went from there was simply that, from a biological point of view, I mentioned that like me as a man, I was the only man in our group, and I would automatically disclose that I obviously I can't relate to you as a 14-year-old girl. I'll never be able to, and especially biologically. And so if there's, I want to be, I want to demonstrate empathy in that area, in that. Um, I understand that if there's anything that you're going through in your developmental phase through puberty as a 14-year-old girl, that if you don't feel comfortable disclosing that, it's totally okay. And if you have any other questions about it that I don't know, I promise to learn more about it and talk to you about it more the next time I see you. But you're in the driver's seat of the whole experience, and what you choose to share and not share is completely all right. And then of course, we shifted on the other side of it, where we're like, our female counselors would obviously have a much greater advantage in that one specific area. I think that the assumption is that the connection would be much quicker than mine would be on the biological point of view. Socioemotionally, I think we thought it was very important that like everything's on the table in terms of how they feel, what their emotions are, the validation. They're allowed to have 100 different emotions about 100 different things at 100 different times, and there are no um, all in an effort again to gain trust and all that.
Yeah.
But also, we were talking about breach of trust in terms of like having to gain trust and having to breach it in terms of if there was like a suicidal ideation, having to involve their parents, or if they had an intention to harm themselves or harm anybody in school, having to alert proper authorities and being honest about that, but also making them understand that we as counselors are here to help facilitate safety for you, the client, things like that. So I know there's a lot more that we can talk about, but I just wanted to navigate that, explain that from our conversation.
No, that's good. Let me ask this question, and this is just a broader question because I don't want to run out of time either. And like I said, well, next class will have a little more time to go through some of these things. But my only general question, really, and this is to everybody, um, did you have any trouble coming up with questions that you wanted to ask? I mean, I would hope not. I would hope you would.
We didn't.
Okay, good. You should have. There's a couple reasons why I like doing things like this. I want you to start learning how to generate questions. That's really important. You should always have a lot of questions, just in general. And there's no dumb questions, really. Um, the second question I was going to ask is, because I've got, like I said, this is super generic. This is not like I didn't give a ton of information on purpose because I kind of wanted you to have leeway. I didn't say anything in here about ethnicity. And so that's just something else to think about. I did that on purpose. I didn't write anything down about that. One thing that I'm wondering about, and this was something I don't know if you got a chance to talk about this because I didn't give you a ton of time. Did anybody talk about any group talk about like possibly interacting with family or bringing in parents or not, or did anyone not talk about that? Let me put it that way.
We discussed it, but ours was an 18-year-old female, and it
Yeah.
was revolving around school and
Yeah.
anxiety, which is like a first year issue that the
Yeah.
majority of them have. So it was like not so much of an issue, but unless the problems were stemming from the
Yeah.
family.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why I'm asking that question specifically is that is another thing just to think about when you're working with adolescents is, do we want to bring in parents or whoever the caregiver is? That's just something else that you would be thinking about. Now, when we're going to do this same activity next class, but it's going to be young adults like 25 and up. So it's not going to be that question won't be on there. It'll be something different, right? That we'll work through. And so I hope you guys found this helpful to at least talk about. We're going to do this again next class. Like I said, I'm sorry. I wish we'd have more time to kind of go through it, but I just wanted everyone to at least get a sense of like walking through a case study. One of the things that you'll find as you go through the program, whichever program you're in, you'll have more questions. You'll have different questions. You'll be thinking about things a little bit differently. Like if I gave you this case study when you're with me in practicum 2, if I gave you this case study, you might look at it differently than you do now, which is makes sense, right? As you're learning more. Um, Let me talk about a couple of housekeeping things real quick. I recorded all the exam grades. I think one of the things I didn't do at the beginning was make it a 25 point uh, exam. I think it was a 100-point exam. So you might have seen your grade is like a 25%. It should be 25 points. I fixed it now. So don't freak out about that. Everybody should have a grade now on your exam. I'll be working on the third uh, exercise this week. I'll get that done this week. Um, and uh, in terms of the paper, I've had a couple of people just send questions about the paper, which is great. That's fine. Please also, check the example I gave on Moodle. Check that out. That can be very helpful, especially for organizing the paper. Just remember that you're going to pick one specific part of the lifespan, and then a specific issue or disorder or whatever that person might be going through, and a way to treat that issue or disorder or how to work with that. Just remember that you're doing it that way. Um, I had some questions about using books as references, which is fine. I usually find it's easier to find articles probably than books, but you can use a book if you want. That's fine. Um, and if you get the paper done early and you want me to look at it, I don't mind doing that either. I've had people send those to me in the past just for like a quick read over, and if see if you're on the right page, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that either. Um, and so remember, it's 4 to 6 pages. Uh, you need 3 different resources besides the book. You can use the book, but you just need 3 other references too. Um, those are the big questions that I've gotten pretty much from everyone. So um, if you have other questions, I don't mind staying on for a little bit longer here at the end if you have other questions. But other than that, if you need to jump off and have a great weekend. And I think we meet again on the 20. Do we meet in February, like the 15th or 22nd or something? Can't remember.
8:80. Okay. I was gonna look something.
22nd.
22nd is what I have.
Yeah,
Yeah,
22nd.
we'll meet.
Oh, cereal, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll meet on the 22nd. So if you need to jump off, awesome. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to stay on and ask, and I'll stick around for a little while for that.
Sandwich.
Thank you.
Sandwich.
Thank you.
What if I have a question, but it's not actually related to lifespan development?
That's okay.
So you said that you're the practicum 2 professor. During that practicum, we're all clearly working adults, right? And we have so many hours that we have to go be working in clinics. Is it impossible and so overwhelming to get done in the evenings and on the weekends, or is it really pretty attainable?
How much farther do you have, Amy?
A year and a half.
Okay. So everything seems impossible right now. It's going to seem a lot more likely as you get closer.
Okay.
And everyone that goes through the program has to figure out a way to make your schedule work. You'll have practicum 1 and 2 to get all your hours. So you need 300 hours total, and 100 of those are direct with clients, which sounds like a lot. But in essence, you have 2 practicums, which is 10 weeks each. So that's 20 weeks, plus the 3 weeks in between, or two and a
You
half
can
weeks in
see
between.
clients in between, and
You can
that's still
see from the
hours,
time you start until you're finished with your hours, you can see clients. I can't think of anybody in the last 3 or 4 years that hasn't finished.
Okay. And for LMFT, it's 3 practicums and how many hours?
So for the LMFT, it's the same amount of hours, but half of the 100 have to be relational.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. But you have to finish one program at a time, and it's probably easier to finish the LPC program first, Because then if you finish the LPC program, and then you have 4 classes to take to finish the LMFT program, and then the third practicum as well. So it's usually the easiest way to go through it. But so if you go the LPC route, you only have 2 practicums. If you do the LMFT route, you have 3 practicums, and that's mainly because you have to get relationship hours, and it usually just takes a little bit longer to do that.
Okay. But it's not actually more hours that you're logging. Okay.
No,
And then I'm sorry if I'm bugging anybody else, but
no,
I'm
you're
just
fine.
mine's been whirling. So that okay, so we finish our practicums and then we have to pass the state tests for our license before we can be considered an associate and start our supervisory hours, correct?
Right.
What
Right.
is that time frame from like, okay, I graduated, I can sit for my exam, I'm going to sit my exam, and I can now see my first patient as an associate somewhere? What's the gap?
So you can take your exam during practicum too. You don't have to wait to take your exam.
Okay.
So I have a ton of students now that take their exam during that practicum or even before.
Okay.
In Texas, if you completed all your academic work, which you have to complete your academic work before you even start practicum, right? So you can't take any classes other than pre-prac, prac 1, prac 2, or prac 3. Those are the only ones you take. You can take the national exam anytime.
Mm-hmm.
And once you take it, after you graduate and you get your transcript, you can apply for your license, your associate license. And the turnaround's between 3 and 4 weeks, I think, right now. It's not very long.
Oh, so it's not very long.
Mm-mm.
Okay, I was just trying to decide. I'm a teacher, so I'm trying to decide, do I need to
Sure.
teach another school year? Where am I at? How can I figure that out? Because the
Yeah,
less
sure.
amount of school years I have to teach, but that would be great for me. Okay,
Yeah.
one more question.
Yeah.
My next question is, so during your supervisory hours, you do clearly you can make money during that process. What is the typical amount of money you make as an associate?
It just depends on where you work. Usually you give a percentage back to the place you work for, or they have a set of, maybe they have a set amount that you make most typically. And so it's usually not very much.
Okay, when you say not very much, like $15 an hour, $30 an hour, where are you looking at not very much being?
So if you work at a place and you have a 60-40 split, which means you get 60 and you charge 100, you get $60, right? So then you have taxes that come out of that. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into it. I actually have a whole class on this
Oh,
in
you
the
do?
practicum. Hmm.
Okay, so we'll get
Yeah.
this information.
Yeah, all those questions you have, probably half of them will be answered in pre-practicum.
Pre-prep. Okay, perfect. So I
Yeah.
can just stress that.
And no, it's okay. And if you want to get ahead, what I would do is I would go on and read, if you're going the LPC route, go on and read the LPC handbook that's on Amerton's site, or the LMFT handbook, and it's got all this information in it. And if you go to the Behavioral Health Executive Committee, BHEC, BHEC.org, I think. If you go there, that's the clearinghouse for all the information you would need for
Okay.
LPC Council.gov, sorry. BHEC.texas.gov. If you go there, you'll have all the information you'll ever want to see about any of the professions. So it's all the mental health professions in Texas that are licensed. So LPC, LMFT, social work, and psychology. Everything's on one page now, so you can go and see all the information about how to get your license, all the requirements, everything. It's all right there.
Okay. Thank you
But
so
this
much.
isn't information that here, I'll put this in the chat for everybody that wants it. It's just not information that everybody knows about, really. Yeah. Good questions, though. Yeah. Any other questions?
What is
Sorry,
the
one
best
other
way to
oh.
prepare for the exam? Um, sorry,
So-
not your exam, but the where you sit
Mhm.
for your license.
Yeah, the national exam is very hard. It's hard. So you're going to study. There's a lot of study materials out there. You'll learn a lot about that in pre-practicum class too. Actually, he'll have students come back and talk about that as well, like former students. Um, I'm assuming that everyone here, well, here's what's going to happen too. Everyone here is going to have to take a practice exam before you start pre-practicum. That practice exam is much harder than the actual national exam. And so once you've passed that pre-practicum exam, I think the number they're looking for is 65, maybe. I can't remember. Um, you'll know kind of what's on the exam because it's basically an old exam. And then when you come out of pre-practicum, Dr. Johnson does a good job of walking you through like what to study and how to study and things like that. We'll talk about it too in practicum too, but we don't talk about it as much because people are already kind of getting ready to take it. But you'll all the classwork you're going through, like is all, it's all fair game. I wish I could tell you what's on it. It changes too. They change the exam periodically, but every theory, all the theories, everything about group, HIPAA compliance, ethics. I mean, everything that you're learning here in the academic work is all part of the exam. So we teach all the concepts that you're going to need to know for the exam. What makes the exam hard is not the information, it's you have to apply what you know to the exam. So in other words, you might have a question and then there's four answers and two of them look right. You have to decide which one maybe. So that's what makes it kind of difficult. But you're going to have plenty of study materials. I mean, there's so many things out there. There's a book called for the LPC. There's a purple book by Roseball that most people use. The LMFT in the LMFT world, there's an actual LMFT like study book that you can get. So there's plenty of materials out there. I just usually tell people to kind of try to finish your coursework before you think too much about it, to be honest with you, because you'll you're going to have plenty of time to get ready for it. And you can take that exam whenever you're ready. You don't have to take it during a practicum. Some people do wait until they graduate and study and then take it later. You can do that too. You don't have to do it, all at once. That's just what some people are doing because they're in a hurry, honestly. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hmm?
Dr. Better, I thought I've heard people say this in passing or not, but like, do we as students pay our practicum, the people who basically proctor us in practicum, like separately from Emberton, or I thought
No,
I've heard people mention this before.
no.
Okay,
It's a class. It's just a regular academic class.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. Now when you
Uh,
start,
uh,
now when you start gathering your associate license, you'll pay. Usually, most people pay their supervisor. Whoever they have supervising them, you pay them once you
okay,
start gathering your hours. Because when you start gathering your hours, you're not practicing under your license. You're practicing under your supervisor's license. So
right.
if that makes sense.
I
Yeah.
actually have one other question. Just sorry, it's kind of relates to probably me and maybe a handful of others, but I don't have a counseling background. I don't have a social work background. I don't work in schools. I'm not a teacher. I'm completely un. I've worked in mentorship roles in what I do, but it's not like my job title
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I kind of have, and I'm halfway through. I'm halfway through the curriculum. I'm just kind of like in my head a little bit about me finding placement for work because of like how my resume reads, because there's nothing educational on my resume basically. And I don't know, I'm worried about callbacks and things like that. I mean, is that something that I should consider and plan for, or like, in your mind?
Yeah, we've had every kind of person. We've had business people, we have police officers, we've had probation officers, we've had people in the finance world. I mean, we've had tons of people that don't have any counseling background. I would say probably maybe half of our students don't have any kind of counseling background. So that's it. That's never going to be a problem. There's two reasons why it'll never be a problem. The first reason is we don't have enough mental health workers anyway, so there's always going to be a job. The second reason is there are quite a few places that have had good experiences with Amberton with our practicum students. And so I don't think you'll have any trouble finding a place to get your
Okay.
hours. I
Okay.
don't think I don't that should not ever be a hindrance to you at all. I
I
wouldn't
appreciate
say.
that. Thanks.
Yeah,
I mean, truly, I'm actually a chef in healthcare. So it's like,
yeah,
but what I do actually is I do mentor a lot of I'm a corporate chef, so I have many other chefs who work
yeah,
underneath me, and I mentor them in terms of like just getting their heads in the right places to like do the work that they need to do. And
sure.
so basically working as an unlicensed counselor
Yeah,
essentially.
sure,
And
sure, sure.
and so yeah, and it's actually through my own counseling experience with my current therapist who kind of this is why I'm here.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm kind of unhappy in my role. And he's like, I do enjoy mentoring. He's like, it sounds like you should be a counselor, bro. I'm like, that's how I
yeah,
ended up here. And so,
yeah, sure.
anyways, I appreciate that feedback.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, yeah. You won't have any trouble. I don't think you
Okay.
have any trouble. No.
Thank you.
Any,
And
yeah.
again, thank you for the Zoom. It was very helpful for me. I'm going to jump
Good.
off, but thanks,
All right.
guys. Have a
Thanks,
good
Mark.
one.
Any other questions about anything?
Mommy.
All right. We'll see everybody next time.